Welcome to this explainer. There's this incredible historical paradox we're going to look at today. How does a state founded by literally the most righteous, benevolent men in history end up collapsing into an absurd, bloody soap opera of total tyranny? It's a fascinating, perfectly cyclical story. We're talking about a society built on the highest possible moral ideals that just crumbles under the weight of petty grievances, stubborn pride, and, well, sheer unrelenting madness. Let's dive right into the wild history of the ancient state of Song. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with 3 benevolent men, then look at the Great Plan, move into centuries of chaos, discuss misguided righteousness, examine the final tyrant, and wrap up with the historian's verdict.
Part 1. 3 benevolent men, standing against the tyrant King Zhou. So to really understand where Song came from, we've got to look backward to the incredibly violent fall of the previous regime, the Shang Dynasty. In its final, darkest days, the Shang was just rotting from the inside out. It was ruled by a guy who had totally abandoned reason for wine and absolute cruelty. But out of all that darkness, the famous philosopher Confucius pointed out something amazing. He highlighted the profound moral foundation of 3 specific survivors who pushed back. At a time when the ruler had completely lost his mind, these 3 distinct individuals, Weizi, Jizi, and Bigan, chose 3 totally different ways to resist terrifying absolute power. Now, this resistance came at an unimaginable cost. Weizi tried giving advice to the king, but when he saw the writing on the wall, he made the agonizing choice to flee. For him, preserving their ancestral lineage was way more important than dying a feudal death. Then there's Jizi. He recognized the immediate danger and actually faked being mad. He lived this miserable existence as a slave, basically hiding his profound sorrow by just playing the guiqin. But Prince Bigan, he took the most direct and dangerous route. He protested right to the king's face, and the tyrant King Zhou responded with just horrific brutality. He had Bigan executed, cut his heart right out of his chest, and sadistically claimed he wanted to see if a supposedly wise man really had 7 holes in his heart, like the ancient myths said. It was out of this exact trauma, this extreme bloodshed, that the conquering Zhou dynasty destroyed the Shang and set up the new state of Song. They put the survivor Weizi in charge, specifically to keep the ancestral sacrifices of his fallen people alive. So you see, this state was born from survivors of the absolute worst kind of trauma.
Part 2. The Great Plan. The Hongfan and Ancient Statecraft.
Right after the conquest, King Wu, the leader of the victorious new Zhou dynasty, sought out the survivor, Jizi. The new king was smart enough to realize that if he wanted to rule effectively and not repeat the catastrophic mistakes of the last guy, he desperately needed to understand the ancient rules of governance. So Jizi reveals the Hongfan, or the Great Plan. He explains that heaven bestowed upon humanity exactly 9 categories of universal philosophy. And here's the absolutely crucial thing to grasp. These weren't just gentle suggestions or human laws. They were seen as the literal, fundamental building blocks of reality. These survivors were trying to codify the very laws of the universe to guarantee another tyrant could never, ever rise to power again. Take a look at the very first of these 9 categories, the 5 elements. Ancient thinkers didn't just pull these out of thin air. They categorized the fundamental forces of reality with incredibly strict, observable logic. Think about it. Water moistens and goes down, and it tastes salty. Fire flames and goes up, giving a bitter taste. Wood bends and straightens, which is sour. Metal yields and changes, giving a pungent taste. And earth lets us sow and reap, bringing sweetness. This wasn't just abstract poetry, right? This was the highly structured, rational foundation that the entire state of Song was supposed to be built and governed on. And all this structured logic builds up to the ultimate human experience in the 9th category, the 5 blessings. The founders weren't after raw power or endless military conquest. They literally mandated a philosophical baseline for a good existence. What were their goals? Longevity, wealth, health and peace, a deep love of virtue, and finally, a peaceful end to life. That was the moral high ground. It was this brilliant, incredibly optimistic blueprint for a perfect society. Part 3. Centuries of chaos, ideals versus a bloody reality. Well, despite those beautiful, lofty ideals, the reality on the ground morphed into a violent soap opera really fast. The state of Song rapidly plunged into a mess of endless assassinations, petty grievances, and brutal betrayals. Within just a few generations, you've got an official named Hua Du, literally murdering a colleague just to steal his beautiful wife. And then, he assassinates the Duke the very next year just to cover his tracks and shut up the angry public. But the absolute peak of this bloody absurdity has to be Duke Min. Get this. Duke Min ransoms a guy named Nong Gong Wan from a rival state. Fast forward a bit, they're casually playing a board game. The Duke gets mad over a bad move and throws a petty insult, calling Wan a captive. How does Nangang Wan respond? He picks up the heavy wooden gaming board and literally beats the Duke to death with it. I mean, these were the men entrusted with the great plan. So much for that peaceful end to life, right?
Part 4. Misguided Righteousness. Duke Xiang at the Battle of Hang. So, the real pivotal turning point in this whole chaotic history arrives with a guy named Duke Xiang. Now, Duke Xiang desperately wanted to return to those ancient virtues we talked about earlier. He wanted to be this righteous leader who did things the old way. But, man, he completely, tragically misunderstood the assignment. The state of Song was facing this massive invading army of Chu at the river Hang. The Chu army was way bigger, but they were currently crossing the river. They were disorganized, wet, and totally vulnerable. Minister Xiu is practically begging the Duke to attack. He's frantically arguing, war is about winning. If we don't strike now, they're going to enslave us. But Duke Xiang, he's completely calm and incredibly stubborn. Clinging to this inflexible idea of chivalry, he says a true gentleman doesn't oppress people in danger, and you never drum an attack on unformed ranks. So he forces his desperate men to just stand there and wait.
And the result of this extreme, borderline suicidal courtesy? Absolute devastation. Duke Xiang actually waited for the massive enemy ranks to finish crossing, dry off, and form up perfectly. Unsurprisingly, the Song army was completely crushed. Duke Xiang himself got severely wounded in the thigh during the slaughter and actually died from that exact injury months later. It's such a profound, tragic lesson that honestly rings true even today. Blind, unthinking adherence to the mere aesthetics of virtue, without paying attention to the pragmatic reality on the ground, can be just as deadly as outright malice.
Part 5. The Final Tyrant. The Vile Rebirth of King Zhou.
Decades of warfare and instability kept rotting the state from the inside out, which finally brings us to the end of the line. The history of Song comes full circle with its last ruler, King Yan. And the sheer irony of his reign is just staggering. King Yan aggressively conquered surrounding lands and decided to declare himself king. But it gets worse. He descended into utter, bizarre madness. He actually had his servants fill leather bogs with blood, hang them way up high, and then he'd shoot arrows at them, bragging that he was shooting heaven. He drowned himself in wine and women. And if any minister dared to step up to advise him or protest, exactly like Prince Bigan did centuries ago, King Yan just shot them dead on the spot. No second thoughts.
The surrounding states looked at Song and basically saw a terrifying ghost. King Yan was the exact rebirth of the vile King Zhou. He was the literal tyrant that Song's benevolent founders had sacrificed everything to escape in the first place. It was this perfect, horrifying cycle. Using that unbelievable irony as their ultimate justification, rival states quickly teamed up. They swept in, totally dismantled the state of Song, wiped it off the map forever, and carved up its lands for themselves.
Part 6. The Historian's Verdict. Sima Qian's Analysis.
So this leads us to the ultimate question. Why did this state, founded by the absolute best of men, armed with the universal secrets of the Great Plan, fail so spectacularly? Well, the ancient historian Sima Qiang argues that the root of the rot wasn't actually the final tyrant, King Yan, and it wasn't just Duke Xiang's terrible battlefield manners either. Sima Qiang traces the real origin of the collapse way, way back to an early ruler named Duke Xuan. You see, Duke Xuan decided to bend the fundamental rules of traditional succession by passing the throne to his brother instead of his son. He honestly thought he was doing something noble and righteous, but Sima Qiang points out that this single, well-intentioned breach in protocol basically shattered the structural integrity of the entire state. It triggered a massive crisis of legitimacy that plunged Song into 10 straight generations of bloody, non-stop instability. It's a wild reminder of how easily a massive system can be compromised by just one supposedly noble exception to the rules. Looking back at the tragic, cyclical history of Song, we're left with a truly fascinating paradox. The founders survived by clinging fiercely to virtue when facing a tyrant. But then later, Duke Xiang was destroyed by his rigid adherence to the rules of war. And finally, the last king was destroyed because he completely abandoned all tradition to literally shoot arrows at heaven. So it really makes you wonder, does rigid adherence to tradition and righteousness serve as a state's ultimate salvation, or does it guarantee its inevitable ruin? Thanks for exploring the annals of Song with me today, and definitely let that question marinate.